If there's one thing that Irish politicians really can't get enough of, it's citizens' assemblies. As Tony the Tiger would say, they're great. Of course, the idea behind a citizens' assembly is very simple. Before the government pursues a policy, they first go to a supposedly representative section of the public and ask the people what they think about the issue. And that way everyone gets to have their say and democracy wins. Now, doesn't that sound lovely? Well, it might be lovely if that was how things actually worked in reality. But let's take a look at one very recent citizens' assembly to see how these things actually go. Let's examine the citizens' assembly on biodiversity. For starters, it's an amazing coincidence that many of the recommendations of the Assembly just so happen to reinforce things that the government already wants to do. It's really shocking how that works, isn't it? For example, one recommendation said that the cessation of turf cutting on protected areas must be fully implemented and enforced. So, in other words, the Citizens' Assembly fully backed the government's extremely controversial turf ban in pursuit of climate goals. And this was supported by no less than 87% of those in attendance, with 11% opposed and 2% who didn't vote. Now, if you followed the government's turf ban saga at all, then this might come as a surprise to you, because this policy is known to be so brutally unpopular with the general public that Fine Gael TDs last year feared it may bring down the government. So in public, it's about as popular as herpes, as the government politicians themselves have admitted, but suddenly within the so-called Citizens' Assembly, it's supported by 87% of people. If I didn't know better, I'd almost suspect that there's some kind of chicanery going on here. One other recommendation along the same lines was that Ireland's food production must adhere to the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, the EU Green Deal, and other international pacts and treaties. Now, most of us talk to a lot of people in the course of our daily life. Shopkeepers, taxi drivers, barbers, and so on. So just think in your own life, how many of those regular people do you think even know what Agenda 2030 is, let alone hold strong views in favour of it? I've literally never met a non-political person in my life who brought up any of these topics independently or even knows anything about them. UN Sustainable Development Goals are not an issue that plumbers and cashiers are really energized about. And yet during the voting stage, this Citizens' Assembly recommendation was supported by 90% of those in attendance, with only 9% opposed. So in other words, it was a crushing landslide in favour of all the government's favourite international climate agreements, which is an amazingly convenient result for the powers that be, isn't it? In fact, it's remarkable just how many of the votes involved over 95%, and in some cases 100% of attendees all agreeing on a particular issue. Almost every topic raised, no matter how controversial, was received with almost unanimous agreement. For example, one motion explicitly called for the NGO on Taisce to be, quote, properly funded and resourced. Now, why is that significant, you ask? Well, because An Taisce is an NGO which is already in receipt of around €3 million in taxpayer funding annually. And what do they do with their funding exactly? Well, they do things like serially objecting to a €150 million Glanbia cheese plant in Kilkenny, which was set to produce hundreds of jobs directly and indirectly and boost Irish agriculture significantly. And An Taisce challenged this plan in the Supreme Court not once but twice, all on the basis that such a factory was supposedly bad for the climate. So they're funded by the taxpayer, and then they turn around and use their resources to attack native industry that would help the economy. One Fianna Fáil TD went as far as to call it a revolting act of treason, while other TDs described An Taisce as the leading threat to the future of rural Ireland. So a very controversial organisation, in other words. And yet, when it was proposed that An Taisce should receive more funding on top of its £3 million it already receives, 95% of attendees in the Citizens' Assembly said that they should receive more money. 95%. For an idea of how amazing that outcome is, that is significantly higher than the 2020 vote result of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who has proudly described himself as a dictator and is widely believed to have committed electoral fraud. Lukashenko only achieved 81% of the vote, meaning that even fake elections rigged by actual dictators typically don't have margins as high as 95%. And yet apparently we're to believe that a random sampling of the public just so happened to achieve over 95% agreement on most issues. Even a highly controversial controversial issues like funding for An Taisce. It's all very believable, alright, if you're a brainwashed peon living in North Korea maybe. And by the way, just as a quick side note, the assembly was actually addressed by an An Taisce representative who explicitly asked for more funding. So I wonder, did that have anything to do with the result? Really makes you think, doesn't it? A real head scratcher, that one. It's clear that the way the information is presented to attendees at the assembly and the framing of the questions is designed to skew the result in favour of official Ireland's chosen policy and agenda. For example, one question is phrased as follows: in line with international best practice, the state must increase mandatory requirements for a percentage of green spaces that support biodiversity in urban areas. And that motion was supported by 95% of attendees. Now, even if you agree with that policy personally, by starting it with in line with international best practice, the premise has already been laid out that there's a consensus on this and most countries are already doing it, so why aren't we? That's the obvious subtext. And whether you agree or disagree with the issue in question is irrelevant. The point is, it's a manipulative framing of the topic. Its goal is to lead people to agree with the government's plans, not to find out how they really feel in some impartial way. Another example of why this is a farce can be seen with the recommendation that, quote, people must be encouraged to consume a more plant-based diet. This was also supported by a significant margin of those in attendance during the voting stage. Now, of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with consuming a plant-based diet. Individuals can eat whatever they like short of cannibalism. Nobody cares what you eat. But a top-down government campaign urging people to radically transform their eating habits would have a huge knock-on effect for Ireland's farming sector, and it has been the goal of the Irish government for years. For example, in 2017, then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said that he was going to be cutting back on his meat consumption, supposedly to save the planet. Similarly, in the same year, former President Mary Robinson said that people, quote, have to become aspiring vegetarians, saying eat less meat or no meat at all. In 2019, the Food Safety Authority even urged people to try vegetarian eating a few days a week. So official Ireland has long wanted to achieve this environmental goal of creating more vegetarians and vegans. And lo and behold, here comes the Citizens' Assembly agreeing with them wholeheartedly. The wonders truly never cease. Of course, this would also have a profound impact on Ireland's farming sector, as pointed out by independent TD Michael Fitzmaurice following Varadkar's comments about eating less meat. Saying something like that may have a direct impact on Irish farming, Fitzmaurice said at the time, adding that Ireland is an agri-based country and that as Taoiseach, Varadkar is effectively the CEO of the country. In a similar vein, the Citizens' Assembly report calls for carbon labelling of food products. The state must require sufficient information on commodity labelling and menus to improve consumer understanding of the origin of their food and the impact of their choices on biodiversity and the environment. And that was supported by 83% of attendees. Once more, this just so happens to dovetail nicely with plans previously outlined by Fine Gael Minister Simon Coveney, who said that, quote, it's only a matter of time before we have carbon labelling. Shocker.
It's only a matter of time before we have carbon labelling on all dairy products, on all meat products. Like, this is the truth. If you want to ignore that, well then we can do that. But in a few years' time, people will then be asking me at meetings like this, why are we getting less price for beef than other farmers are in other parts of Europe that are making these changes that we need to make?
Believe it or not, people even repeatedly asked for NGOs to be given more money, arguing that NGOs engaged in biodiversity should be appropriately funded in the short, medium and long term to undertake targeted schemes with measurable outcomes and strict accountability measures. A separate motion said core funding should be provided for collaborative work between NGOs and their partners, and yet another one said the NGO sector must be actively developed and resourced to assist the state in addressing the biodiversity crisis. The Assembly believes the non-governmental organisation sector plays a critically important role in biodiversity in Ireland. However, compared to many other countries, public funding supports for NGOs in Ireland is poor. But maybe that has something to do with the fact that NGOs were by far the biggest group of speakers addressing the Assembly, and another significant group was people from government agencies and local authorities. So to put it another way, way, they brought in a load of NGO workers and government officials to talk to the crowd, and then the crowd's takeaway was that NGOs need more money. Now, who could have seen that one coming? And we know for a fact that many of these NGOs are engaged in lobbying and advocacy, as Minister Paschal Donohoe admitted to me earlier this year.
It is the case that many are involved in advocacy and they do receive state funding, but they also provide very valuable public services.
Now, there's plenty of other nutty stuff that we could go over here, from having a constitutional referendum that would give nature its own legal rights, to dropping the concept of GDP to put the climate change issues at the very core of all economic decisions, and much more. So the madness truly never ends. But all of this just indicates that the Citizens' Assembly and public consultations are what we have always suspected them to be: an undemocratic sham of a system designed to launder public support for the government's hobby horse ideas. That's all it is, and that's all it was ever intended to be, as Micheál Martin himself told us in 2016.
How can the process be run in such ways to ensure that it's not just the loudest voices that get a hearing? I attended a hearing on the Constitution Convention. I'm not so sure what transpired on the day I was there reflected where the vast majority of the Irish people were.
In fact, he said that it shouldn't even be called a Citizens' Assembly because those who participate in it aren't even elected by the people.
I don't accept the idea that a Citizens' Assembly, and it's a wrong term, Citizens' Assembly. There's only one Citizens' Assembly, and that's the one elected by democratic franchise, direct election by the people.
He said that often the Assembly just ends up being a mouthpiece for, quote, the loudest lobby group of the day.
What tends to happen is when structures like this are established, Taoiseach, those who are selected are well-meaning, I've no difficulty with that, but very often they become subject to the loudest lobby group, the loudest advocacy group of the day. And the vast majority of people living in the country are going about their daily lives and are very largely removed from the deliberations of it.
And bearing in mind what you just heard, note that just in recent years alone, Martin launched citizens' assemblies on biodiversity loss, a directly elected mayor for Dublin, drug use, and now he's planning one on Irish neutrality, not to mention many others. So it turns out that Martin thinks that the Citizens' Assembly is totally fake. He believes it's controlled by these weirdo lobby groups that don't speak for most people, and yet he also wants to hold an assembly every 5 minutes apparently. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Taoiseach Leo Varadkar already nuked the legitimacy of public consultations when I asked him about it a couple of weeks ago.
The vast majority of people don't make submissions to public consultations. We have to bear that in mind. It's only a small portion of the population that participate in these things, so it's not necessarily reflective of public opinion. And also we're wise to the fact that very often submissions are organised, or campaign groups will organise responses, so we're clear with that too.
But why hold the consultation if the end result is just going to be disregarded on the basis that it's not representative of public opinion? What's the point of it then?
Well, the point is that we're a democracy, and in Ireland we have elections, and decisions are made by the government and the elected parliament. They're not made on foot of public consultations or opinion polls. That's not what they're about. They're about testing the temperature.
So is it just for show then?
No.
So they know it's a piss take, we know it's a piss take, and yet the system continues unabated. What an absolute joke. Please like and share this video, and if you enjoyed it, please consider signing up for a monthly donation via the link on screen to help us produce more content like this. Alternative media like Gript needs all the assistance it can get, and every donation goes a long way. As always, thanks for watching.